Hi, folks at home and people in the room. Hi, everyone. If we have not met before, my name is Sydney Kraviak, and I'm the Program and Outreach Coordinator for Adult Services at the library. So I help plan programs for adults, like tonight's Growing Great Garlic with Dr. Candy DeBerry. A few things before I turn it over to Dr. DeBerry. The library does close at 8 p.m. tonight. So after the program wraps up, we have an end time of 7:30. And if you have lots of questions for Candy after that, she'll share her contact information. So feel free to reach out to her via email as well. If you are watching from home, I'm going to be monitoring the chat and we'll open it up for questions at the end. So we'll take questions from people here in the room and from folks at home. It is being recorded. So if you need to go back and refer to anything, or if you want to share it with anyone, you're more than welcome to as well. So if you did not grab it when you came in, Candy has some paper and pens up here to take notes if you need to. So without further ado, tonight we have Dr. Candy DeBerry. This is her second program this year doing something with us. So she was here earlier in the summer talking about compost, and she's back this fall to talk to us about garlic. And right now is the perfect time to talk about garlic. So Absolutely. Thanks for being here.
So please, for the folder with the handouts, you should have two handouts in it. One's a 2-page garlic and perennial onion growing guide from Southern Exposure Seed Exchange. And the other is a handout about a protocol for disinfecting and fertilizing garlic before planting, if you're interested in that, and also contact information for me if you are interested in garden speakers. So thanks, Sydney. Thanks, Peters Township Public Library. Thanks all of you coming out on a nice autumn evening to listen to me talk instead of be out in the yard gardening. So you've probably heard growing garlic is easy. You hear that a lot. I read that a lot. And the reality is that getting a garlic crop is fairly easy. Getting a good garlic crop is not. There's a big distinction. But so many people want to do it because, seriously, are you going to behave or not? Who doesn't like garlic? Right? Okay, we're not going to discuss those people. They stayed home tonight. Right? But I'll tell you who doesn't like garlic. Bambi doesn't like garlic. Don't have them fenced out, have them sleeping in your backyard, coming up to the door saying, "Where's my coffee? It's morning." This is a great crop. I do absolutely nothing to protect my garlic from deer.
He doesn't want to feel pressured.
First year I grew garlic was, I put it fall of 2010. And I have had absolutely zero evidence of deer eating any of the garlic, even nibbling on the edges in all of those years. They even ate my leek last winter.
To do it ourselves,
but they have never touched my garlic. Now,
your dad
this may not apply to you. If you are hungry enough, they try to eat just about anything. But this would be one of the last things that they would go for. So Bambi is not a garlic connoisseur, which is good. Now we're going to get really complicated because there are more than 600 different varieties of garlic. That's the bad news, or maybe the good news if you like to try a lot of different things. But one aspect of that, to simplify it in your mind, and Nature simplified it, they can be divided really into 3 groups. And I'm only really going to talk about one tonight. Soft neck garlics, hard neck garlics, which are what I grow, and elephant garlics. And I'm really not going to say anything else about elephant garlics because they're not even true. They're not garlics. They're a different species. They're actually leeks. They look like garlic. You have those are the really big bulbs with the big cloves. They're much more mild than soft neck or hard neck true garlics. They're cooked more like leeks. And that's all I'm going to say about elephant garlics in this presentation, except that culture is basically pretty much the same. Okay. I'm going to focus on soft neck and hard neck garlics. And first, what's the difference? Soft neck garlics have a lot more leaves, and they don't have a flower stalk. Okay. That's the main distinguishing above ground feature. So hardneck garlics, early June or so in our area, will send up a central hard stalk that has a flower, a developing flower on the end. And that hard stalk with the developing flower is called a scape. And that is delicious. If you let it go, it will flower. The top part, the spathe, will flower and it will actually make little bulbils. But we'll see, most people take that off and consume it. So we'll get there. So the soft neck garlics are really two subgroups, the artichokes and the silver skins. And the silver skins probably what you're buying at the grocery store, which, by the way, is probably imported from China and not grown in the US. So there's interesting. There are more types of hardnecks. There are about 8 different subtypes of hardneck garlics. And the ones that are the easiest to grow, the least challenging, are the porcelains. I'm only at this point only growing porcelains. I have grown an Asiatic variety in the past and lost it to pink rot, actually. But porcelains are pretty easy to grow, and that's where people recommend, especially garlic beginners. And also, I read a lot of information from growers who are stating, basically, we're just only growing porcelains, or we're increasing our proportion of porcelains. Easy to grow, and a lot of different types, even within that subtype. So let's look below ground.
You said about a flower back on that picture. Okay, I'll get those little. Oh, mine was telling me to snap those.
Yep, we'll get there.
Okay, so that is.
We'll get there. That's a hard neck. We will get there. Well, not if you snap it off.
Okay, that's why I was asking.
Yeah, we'll get there.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Let's look below ground. Cut those bulbs in cross section. And the soft neck, there's no core. There's no stiff core coming up. Lots of cloves, but no central hard core. So that hard neck is the bottom of that scape that came up with the flowering stalk. So I have a sample of each. This I bought at the farmer's market. The larger one is a soft neck. And if you look inside, there just is no hard stalk, like a little hard neck that I grew. So I thought I would just pass those around if you want to take a look at them and see what's illustrated on here in 3D. So those are the kind of the structure differences. There are other differences between soft necks and hard necks in addition to structure. Okay. Soft necks tend to do better in warmer climates. You can grow soft necks around here, but they are usually associated with growing south of Pennsylvania. They keep longer than the hard necks. Some varieties can keep almost 1 year. The cloves tend to be smaller, tend to be more difficult to peel, and they're not as pungent. So they have more mild flavors, and they don't have what some people call the complexity of flavors that hardnecks do. So if your priority is a longer keeping bulb, then you might want to do soft necks. Another advantage of soft necks is that because they don't have that stiff scape sticking up, it's easy to take those flexible leaves and braid them. So you can make these beautiful braids for storing, or people will decorate the braids, sell them as a braid of garlic, enter them in the fair, all sorts of things. If your priorities are more toward easier to peel or more complexity of flavor, perhaps, then you might want to do hardnecks. They don't last as long in storage. You can get some that'll last 6 months or more, but they will start drying out, shriveling up, sprouting. You'll see little green growth coming out the top of the cloves. You will tend to have fewer cloves that are larger, and they're easier to peel. And the flavors are more complex. The way I think about this sometimes is that soft necks are the garlic equivalent of like hybrid tomatoes, something like a big boy. It'll produce, it'll be, you know, disease resistant and so on, but it doesn't have that true old-fashioned complex tomato flavor, and you don't get the diversity of flavors that you would with real heirloom tomatoes, like a Cherokee Purple, right? Or a Brandywine, or pineapple, whatever. So there's my rough analogy. And they each have advantages and disadvantages. It depends on what the grower wants and the eater wants. Right? So I'm going to take you through the story of a year in growing garlic. And I'm going to start right now. Actually, I haven't started yet. I pledged myself I would start this weekend, preparing the bed. Right now, the bed I'm going to put garlic in has fingerling potatoes that I got to get out. So I got to do a lot of digging this weekend. But you want a location in full sun or very light shade. And I know this because I've been planting my garlic in the same location for several years. And the crabapple tree has grown dramatically, and I had a lot more shade this year. I had really thick stalks, and I thought these are going to be enormous bulbs. And I pulled them up, and they were less than average for me. They had put their growth above ground to harvest more sunlight, and it didn't all translate into the bulbs. I'm moving them into full sun again. So you would still get a harvest, but I'm shameless. I want the blue ribbon at the fair. I'll be honest. I want the ribbons at the fair. So I really go, I go for size. I really want big bulbs. A lot of people plant in raised beds. I have done that in the past. I've stopped that mainly because I'm using my raised beds for other things like peppers and tomatoes. But raised beds are great because you have good drainage. And garlic really doesn't like wet feet. Okay? So if you have a raised bed, you might want to devote it to your garlic crop or build a raised bed for your garlic crop. Then you can get really rich soil, really loose soil. You control what you put in there in terms of the soil and the fertilizers and all of that. And you don't have to start with heavy Pennsylvania clay and improve it. Whatever, loose, fertile, lots of organic matter. So this is where you're digging in rotted compost. You've been digging in shredded leaves, chopped up brush, you know, here unrotted compost and trench composting, putting it in there and letting it rot for a year, whatever. Garlic tends to be what's called a heavy feeder. So it's going to need a lot of nutrients, particularly a decent amount of nitrogen. And it likes the soil slightly acidic. So it should be okay in this area, but it's always recommended get a soil test. And probably the most accurate ones, or some of the most accurate ones, would be getting them through Penn State Extension. The best thing to do is get your soil tested so you actually know what your organic matter is, how much nitrogen is in that soil, how much phosphorus, how much potassium, all of those things, rather than guess. Although even if you just guess, you can probably going to end up with a decent crop. So again, it's difficult to fail with garlic, but it's also difficult to really succeed, right? So to use the baseball analogy, since Brooks Robinson's on my mind as a Marylander, we just saw Brooks Robinson died. So any Orioles fans? Oh, you people. How about them O's, Juan? Anyway, since baseball's been on my mind, it is easy to get on base, but it is very difficult to hit it out of the park. So I just kind of automatically, and maybe I'm not the best way to do it because I really should be doing consistently soil tests, but sometimes I cut corners myself. I pretty consistently put in as much compost as I can spare. So this is well rotted down compost. So most recommendations are anywhere from 1 inch over your bed to even 3 or 4 inches. I don't know where those people are getting it because I don't generate that much compost in my backyard. But a layer of compost. I put a very light dusting of wood ashes from our wood stove. So this could be, or from an outdoor fire pit, or your neighbor who has a wood stove, or from your camping trip over the summer, but a very light dusting. Don't put too much on because it's very alkaline and it can increase your pH. Outside of the range, it'll get a little too alkaline, your garlic won't be as happy as it could be. But a light dusting, get some good phosphorus and potassium for those bulbs. And I'm addicted to seaweed meal or kelp meal. I kind of consider that my secret ingredient, although I just gave you my secret. So there you go. Watering with aquarium water is awesome. I would absolutely use it if I have anything like that. We water from water that we've, for instance, boiled corn in for corn on the cob. Anything like that for nutrients is great. But kelp meal is essentially ground up seaweed, dried ground up seaweed. It is not really a very good fertilizer. It has very little nitrogen, almost no phosphorus, not much potassium. So you're not using this as a fertilizer for NP and K, the macronutrients. What you're doing is using it for all the micronutrients. There are like more than 60 different minerals in there: the calciums, the borons, the seleniums, the magnesiums, the manganese, all the other nutrients that the plants need. There are at least 12 different vitamins, and there's a whole array of plant hormones. Seaweed grows really fast. There's some species of seaweed that can grow 1 foot a day. Yeah, well, that's more like a foot. I'm sorry, I think in the metric system. So I was like, a meter, not a foot. 1 foot a day. So nutrient rich, plant hormone rich, vitamin rich. And yeah, okay, you can go to Ace Hardware and buy the 6-pound bag or whatever. Go hardcore, people, okay? Go hardcore. 50 pounds at 84 Agway. Seriously. No, if you keep it dry, it stores very well for several years. You can use it in anything. Yep. So, should, because of all those micronutrients that the plants need. So I literally buy 50-pound bags at 84 Agway. It's a lot cheaper per pound. Don't tell Ace Hardware that, but anyway. And I just keep it in a dry place. It's great stuff. Now I turn it in the soil. Turn it in the soil when I'm prepping the soil. So after I dig the potatoes this weekend, I'm going to round up as much compost as I can find, dig that in, sprinkle some wood ash, and put goodly amounts of kelp. I would probably put in a space about the size of the top of my laptop, half a handful. I really get a nice hard dusting, because this is something you're not going to go wrong with. The only thing you're doing is draining your pocket for paying for this. Okay. And once you get that turned into the soil and let that sit and mellow for a couple of weeks before you plant, you have to think, where am I going to get my bulbs? Mm-hmm. Lots of places, some choices that aren't so good. You may hear people say, go to the grocery store and buy them, or go to Whole Foods and buy the organic ones, right? Well, the problem is that most of those have been treated with chemicals to retard sprouting, to keep them from sprouting. That means you put them in the soil and plant them, they're not going to sprout. So the grocery store, even Whole Foods, even the food co-op in Pittsburgh, I wouldn't gamble on it. Farmers market. A lot of people recommend the farmers market. I bought one year garlic from an organic grower at our farmers market in Washington. I planted 100 cloves. I was going to expand I usually grow about 50 a year. I was going to expand my production. I was all excited about this. I was going to start supplying. I had someone who would say they would buy some. I was actually going to be supplying someone with garlic. I planted 100 cloves. Ordinarily, I would expect 100 plants because almost every one is going to survive. I got 12. Yeah, you laughed. I still can't laugh. I mean, basically, that took me out of garlic production for a year. I had almost nothing, and they were sad. I think they were treated. Honestly, it's the only thing I can think of was that they had been treated, and either the farmer didn't know or the farmer didn't understand what I was asking. I'll give them a break. But that's the only explanation I can come up with. So I'm getting mine from seed companies and from specialty garlic growers. Or actually, I'm not really getting that many because once you buy garlic and plant it and harvest it, you keep some of it for the next year. So you really only need to purchase once. But, who can only have one type, right? I'm growing one type this year. I decided I'm going to expand. So this fall, I'm going to plant 4 different types. So I had to buy. Where do I buy? These are my shameless plugs for my favorite gardening seed companies. I love, love, love Southern Exposure Seed Exchange. They're based in Central Virginia. They are so committed to heirloom varieties of vegetables and very, very progressive company. You can find things there that are very difficult to find anywhere else, but they also carry a lot of the standards. And just all my interactions with them over the phone, by email, in person, have been terrific. So I love Southern Exposure Seed Exchange. I also love High Mowing Organic. They're up in Vermont. They were the very first seed company in the United States to commit to selling only organic seeds. Not a mix of organic and non-organic, but only organic seeds. So that's a huge catalog. And they're constantly growing. And then if you've heard of any of these, you've probably heard of Johnny's. Johnny's Selected Seeds in Maine. Very, very widely used by small organic growers or even larger growers. So all of those are great places, not just to get seed garlic, but other seeds as well. I'm trying something different this year. I ordered from a specialty garlic company called Keen Garlic. They're based in Wisconsin. I haven't gotten the bulbs yet, so I'm getting a little anxious. But Keen was highly recommended on a lot of garlic growers' Facebook posts, and I thought I'd risk it. One of the neat things about Keen Garlic, you can choose the size of bulb you want. So if you don't want to spend so much money and you're mainly concerned about growing it to eat it, you can spend a little less and get culinary sized bulbs. If you want the blue ribbon at the fair, you can spend a little more and buy the jumbo bulbs. They actually have several different sizes depending on your needs as a grower. There are lots of other good places, but I'm just sharing the ones with which I've had communication, contact, experience buying, the ones that I feel confident about recommending. Okay. Keen, we'll see how it goes, but I'm feeling good so far. So I focus on hardnecks because I like the flavors better, because I like things that are easier to peel, because I like getting the scapes in June, and because I like things that are easier to grow, that I can feel more confident that I'm going to have a decent harvest. And out of those 8 different types of hardnecks, everyone recommends starting with the porcelain varieties. But there are dozens and dozens and dozens of different porcelains. So which ones? I grow German extra hardy, and I've been growing German extra hardy for years now. And it is extra hardy. They can take cold really well. However, the variety that you will probably read or hear most recommended is music. It's supposed to have really big bulbs and really big cloves, and I broke down and I ordered some this year. So I'm going to start growing music. I'm also going to grow Georgian crystal and another variety that's not up there. But these are the varieties that you'll read or hear most often recommended for first-time growers, for people who maybe don't want to baby their garlic quite as much as possible, but to take a little more relaxed approach and still have a great outcome. Okay. So what's next after we get the beds ready? About mid-October, I'm going to start to get anxious, and I'm going to be living on the Weather Channel, looking at the 2-week forecasts. Right? The gardener's best friend, the Weather Channel. Nope. I want the scientific weather prediction for the next 2 weeks. I want to watch it because if I plant the garlic earlier than I need to, the garlic is going to this is warm, this is terrific. And it's going to start growing. So you'll have more greenery. You might have greenery coming up above the ground, which usually isn't a problem. But also, apparently, the garlic will then make more cloves that are smaller. I don't want more cloves that are smaller. That's more peeling. I want fewer cloves that are larger, less peeling, easier to peel. So I try to push it back. And as long as there's warm weather out, pretty warm weather out in the forecast for 2 weeks, I hold off another day or two. The ideal is, you always hear, plant garlic after your first or second light frost, but a month before the ground freezes. I just aim for somewhere between really mid-October and early November. Or in my brain, this fall break, and if I go much beyond Halloween, I get anxious. You have to do a little bit of prep. So you pick out now if you just bought the bulbs, you have what you have. But if you have more than you need, then you pick out the nicest ones. The most symmetrical ones, the largest ones, the ones that look the healthiest and cleanest. And a day or two, or even an hour or two before you go to plant them, you pop the cloves. And that's actually the term for breaking the cloves apart. So you'll hear garlic growers talk about clove popping. Break them apart into individual cloves, and then I sort them out by size. The little ones I keep to eat. And the largest ones I usually plant in order, going from the very largest ones down until I fill my bed or decide, that's how many I want to plant this year. But for the biggest garlic, the recommendation is usually, for the largest garlic, largest cloves from largest bulbs. But if you're just starting out and you only have 2 bulbs or 5 bulbs, plant them all. Because if you only get a tiny bulb next year, it's still going to taste great. And just eat it instead of save it. So that's my selection from last fall on our deck. I pulled out 10 or so largest bulbs, most symmetrical bulbs, and I popped the cloves, and I just put them in a little bucket. So those are only the large cloves, and some of them are pretty big. Those were my seed garlic for planting. The smaller cloves, I just put in the kitchen to eat. And then I did something last year that I had never done before. So I did an experiment, and I cannot tell you how it turned out because this was also the year that I had too much shade on the bed. So I think something that would have helped my yield was balanced by too much shade that cut my yield. But Keen Garlic in particular, that online company that I ordered from, recommends pre-soaking the cloves in disinfectant and in fertilizer. So I took an excerpt from their page, kind of stripped down some of the useless verbiage, and tried to turn it into a little recipe, or as a scientist would say, a protocol for doing this. And basically, the disinfectant is to kill mold spores or insect eggs, or maybe even insect larvae that might be in that garlic. 10 minutes, no more. You don't have to spend a lot of money on this. You don't have to go out and buy a bottle of rubbing alcohol or a bottle of hydrogen peroxide. Cheap vodka will work. Seriously, something that would be used as a disinfectant. Then strain those garlics out of there. Get them away from the disinfectant and put them into fertilizer. So this is a liquid fertilizer solution. And I use a mix of fish emulsion and kelp seaweed extract. So that information's on the handout. Then you can soak them 30 minutes up to even overnight. Strain them so they've been cleaned up, and then you give them some food. It's going to soak into those wrappers, and they're going to have a little bit of food as you tuck them into bed for the winter. Leave the wrappers on. There are plenty of growers who claim that it doesn't make any difference, but don't take them off, at least. But I've planted ones where half the wrappers were missing and they seemed fine. Pointy end up. So they all have that pointy end, and then the flat end is at the bottom where the roots will come out, down near what's called the basal plate. So pointy end up. How far apart? Depends on how much space you have and whether or not you want really big bulbs. So if you want really big bulbs, you need to give them space to grow and harvest nutrients. So the recommendation is as much as 10 inches apart. Although most of the time you read it, you'll read about 6 inches. But for the really big ones, you might want to go larger if you have the space. How deep? Well, let's look at a layout. I'm not a row crop person just because I don't have room for row crops in my little backyard. So this is a couple of years ago in a raised bed. So you can get some, this was a 3-foot by 6-foot raised bed. And these are probably somewhere around 7 or 8 inches from each other. So I don't have them in rows. I just filled the bed. And then because it's only 3 feet wide, I could reach in from both sides. So you can get a lot more if you plant in raised beds or in wider rows than a single little narrow row of just one after the other lined up like dominoes. And I put them on the ground, just kind of spaced them out. Then it's time to actually get them in the soil to bury them. And what I typically do is just pick one up and dig a little hole with my fingers. As you saw, dirt is not an issue in that earlier picture. Just dig a little hole and drop them down there until there's about 2 or 3 inches of soil on top. I give them a nice little pat. I try to do this when there's rain in the forecast in the next couple of days so that I don't have to worry about watering them. But if there's no rain in the forecast, you might want to take a sprinkler and give them a drink. But you're not done yet. The soil is important to cover, but they need a blanket. They need some organic mulch on top to keep them warmer, so they don't have such dramatic changes in the temperature down there a few inches in the soil. Okay. To prevent, say, erosion of the soil on top. And this is stuff that's fairly finely shredded. So one thing that I do, one of my hobbies in fall, and if you see me in your neighborhood, please don't come out on your door with step on the shotgun. I'm not stealing from you. I'm just stealing your leaves. I leaf thief. Shamelessly. It's one of my favorite games. I'm the person running around the neighborhood picking up all the bags of leaves that my neighbors have kindly raked up and left by the curb for me to take and use as mulch, so I don't have to buy mulch. And you can fit 15 bags of leaves in a 2018 Prius. Okay, I just want you to know that. If you don't, you got to go by yourself, because you're gonna have to put two. You're gonna have to put two in the passenger seat. But you can fit 15 bags of leaves. You might have to sit on them to squish them a little. Make sure you don't have sticks in there when you sit on them. Don't ask me why. I know that, but it's amazing how many. They're throwing away free mulch, people. So I drag the bags home and unload them in front of the house, and I run over the leaves with a lawnmower. So I'm cutting them up. Or if I have straw, I'll do the same thing with straw. I just did that the other day for mulching leeks for the winter. Grass, I wouldn't do grass clippings by themselves. I might mix them in with leaves or straw. And as a matter of fact, that's exactly what I did for my leeks the other night. Yeah, as long as you don't put toxic chemicals on your grass. So I just took the straw and took the flakes of straw and just shook it out over my lawn, which I hadn't mowed, and then just ran over it and collected it in the bagger. So I have a mixture of straw and grass. The problem with grass clippings, well, there are a couple. One is that they mat down and they form a dense mat. And then if they dry out, it's very difficult for water to get past that. The other is that if you add a thick layer of wet grass clippings, they'll decompose in there very rapidly, and they'll actually heat up. And they can start to stink because they're very nitrogen rich. So mixing it with something that's carbon rich, like leaves or straw, would be awesome. But I do use grass clippings for mulch in the summer. I will put a couple of inches around things in my pepper beds or my tomatoes. But certainly for putting something down for the winter, I wouldn't use just straight grass. But adding it to other stuff, great idea. Lots of nitrogen. So you've tucked them in the soil. You've put their comforter of mulch over top. And they're big. They're going to be putting on a lot of root growth. But they might start some top growth of leaves before it gets too cold. Don't freak out. That's okay. If you see some of them poking up above the mulch, they're fine. Now, if they get that tall above the mulch, you need to protect them. But if they're just a little bit above, they can handle a few even hard frosts before that top growth stops and they go into winter. If they get really tall, you probably planted them too early, or we just had a really warm fall, much longer than expected. In that case, I would just throw some loose straw over top to give them a little protection. But if they're only putting up a little bit of green before we go into the hard winter, they'll be fine. The very tips might turn yellow, but they'll be fine. It's not going to hurt the production very much. And then you let them do their thing through the winter. And I basically ignore them until the middle of March. Somewhere around March 15th or up to the vernal equinox, spring equinox. And then I really start looking, because then I should start seeing some new growth. These green ones should be showing up. We're getting longer. And that's when I go out and I pull the mulch back and I look. Are you there? I start, where are you? And you may see yellow leaves under there. They're starting to reach for the light. That's when you pull the mulch back around them. And then you tuck it up. So as their heads are covered with mulch, you pull it away, uncover their heads, and then tuck it around their necks. So you want them to be able to see, get to the sunlight, start photosynthesizing, really growing, but keep the mulch close to retain moisture, to suppress the weeds, because garlic does not do well against weeds. Neither does onions, neither do leeks, neither do shallots. None of the alliums do well against weeds. So mulch is your best friend because then you don't have to do much weeding. So I pull them back. This always gets me excited. It's March and it's still cold and we're still running the wood stove and there might be an ice storm or whatever, but I have green things in the garden. And then it's time to feed them. Usually around the end of March, if not a little earlier, I give them some nitrogen. And there are really two choices you have. I like to spray the leaves, what's called foliar feeding, or water the leaves. So I'll take seaweed extract and fish emulsion and mix it in water. It's usually about a couple of tablespoons to a gallon of water. It stinks. Repels the deer, by the way, at least for a few days. It also repels your neighbor and your spouse, but I mean, it smells like rotten fish, but, and you could use a sprayer. Sometimes if I have a small crop, I will literally just use an old spray bottle that I've cleaned up. Or you could use a garden sprayer. You could put it in a watering can and sprinkle them and just let the foliage get wet with that weak fertilizer solution. And you can do that every couple of weeks until about the middle of May. Now, if you don't want to keep track of the time, you don't want to smell like dead fish, okay? And you don't want to have to do this every couple of weeks. You could just purchase something that's high in nitrogen, like blood meal, a little bag of blood meal, and dig back the mulch and maybe just put a little teaspoon near each plant and then cover the mulch back up. And the rains will water it in and they will slowly pick up the nitrogen that way. That way you only have to take care of them once instead of coming back every couple of weeks and giving them liquid fertilizer. You could give them powdered fertilizer just once and let them go. Either way works. They're hungry. They've been pulling a lot of nutrients from the earth. They're photosynthesizing. They're growing like crazy. It is amazing how quickly garlic grows. And then sometimes it snows in April. You might remember this from 2 years ago. That was a surprise. We had a very heavy wet snow and I was freaking out because that is like the worst time of the academic year for me. And I am so busy. I can barely remember to eat. And all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, the garlics got snowed on. Well, they did not at all care. It did not set them back at all. It never really got cold enough to freeze them solid. So they were fine. It was just a damp snow. And they were fine. And you could see by that time, essentially a month's worth of growth since they started emerging in March, they're pretty big. They're about the size of those spring onions you would buy in the grocery store. Keep the weeds away. It doesn't do well with competition. If you mulch well, you won't have very many. Keep the soil moist. Yeah. So once those spring rains start to taper off, and it starts to get a little drier, kind of the middle of May or so, beginning of May, you might want to watch. And if we go through a dry spell, you might want to water them because they really would do best if they have about an inch every week. And then it gets crazy. So during this time from really mid-March, when they start to grow their bulb, and then middle of June, they've put up their flowering stalk, the hard necks. They're starting to divide the bulb into cloves. There's tremendous growth, and they need a tremendous amount of nutrients and a lot of water. But those last couple of weeks, when they're dividing their cloves and putting the wrappers around every clove, the best thing to do is stop watering them, which is not usually a problem because it's getting drier. We're not in April and May anymore. We're moving into mid-June, late June, early July. So about mid-June, if it gets dry, don't worry about them. They're okay. I've been known to run out and cover mine with plastic to keep them dry if we were going to have heavy rain. And in a raised bed, it wasn't that hard. I just put some sticks in the ground and held the plastic over and made them a little tent for a day. Now, if you ignore all this, you'll still get a garlic crop. But if you're crazy and take care of your garlic obsessively, then you might get a great garlic crop. And you get scapes. And at this point, you're like, I've been watching this garlic for months and I'm getting hungry and I ate all the old garlic from last year and I really want garlic. And that's fine because you have hardneck garlic and they're sending up those flower stalks or scapes. And they can come up very fast. And those white parts at the end are actually the developing flowers inside. If you want, leave one or two to go because the flowers are beautiful and they attract a lot of pollinators, pollinating insects. The wasps love them, bees love them. But if you want the largest bulbs, snap them off or cut them off. Okay. And then you may have an armload of scapes. So studies have shown that if you cut those flowering stalks off, those scapes, the bulbs can be 20 or even 30% larger than if you let the scapes go. So they don't have to put energy into that flower. They're going to save it all for the bulb. Those scapes come up and they do a curlicue. And then they start straightening out again. You want to get them before they straighten out again because they will get, the stalk will get tough and woody, kind of like old asparagus, and it's not going to be very tasty and very stringy. So get them before, really when they just start to turn over, when they kind of look like a shepherd's hook, that's when they're nice and tender and a decent size. And they're also easy to hook over your arm and carry around and take fun photos. They are wonderful. I use them just like garlic for cooking. They are going to, how do people describe this? They won't be as hot and spicy. They won't be as pungent. The term that usually people describe them as is grassy. They're grassier. They're definitely juicier. It is a different flavor. You could tell it's garlic, but it is not the more dry, pungent, complex kind of flavor. This scapes just kind of scream, it's spring. So I eat them, we freeze them, we chop them up and freeze them and just throw handfuls into soups or whatever. I trade them with one of my colleagues who is Indian and she makes the most amazing vegetable korma. So I give her vegetables and she gives me food, which is wonderful. So there are all sorts of things. And it's wonderful to give someone who loves to cook, but maybe hasn't tried scapes before. I can talk about bulbils afterwards. We'll get there. You actually can use those to propagate. After the flowers bloom, it'll set little tiny, what look like little tiny bulbs that are called bulbils. But if you plant those, it's 2 years to harvest. There. When do you harvest? When at least a third of the leaves have turned brown. Okay. So for us, this is typically somewhere between the beginning of July and about July 10th was the latest. If you get them too early, the biggest problem is that they're not as big as they could be. and maybe the divisions between the cloves aren't as fully formed. If you do it too late, each one of those leaves is a wrapper, is a peel around the bulb. If you let it go too long, those peels start dying and breaking open, and you pull up your bulb and it doesn't have an intact wrapper. Those are fine to eat, but they don't last as long. They don't store as well. So you have to eat those first. It'll look like someone took a knife and just split open the wrappers, and you can see inside to the cloves. That's just saying, I was in the ground too long. I'm still fine to eat, but I was in the ground too long. Dig them deep. Don't try to pull them up. I mean, look at these roots. Don't try to pull them up. Okay. Dig around them and gently lift them up. And then you can brush the dirt off gently. And then you can eat them just like that. You can consume them right away. But if you want to store them for a while, you need to dry them. No sunlight. Covered. Don't let them get wet. Some people wash them off. Don't let them get wet. They don't store as long. Well ventilated. Some people actually put fans on them.
How about the garage where it's fairly dry?
I put mine in the basement. Yep. Yep. Or I will have hung them in our little woodshed lean-to where they don't get any sun. They're just in the shade. Yep, absolutely. And then let them go for 2 to 3 weeks. You want the foliage to be completely dry. So if you bend it and it still feels really flexible, or if you cut it open and you see anything green or it feels damp, it's not done yet. So you can hang them. Okay. Or you can just spread them out. That's what I did. I just spread them out on a picnic table in our basement. And they had good air circulation. I tried to put them on a clothes drying rack, but the weight collapsed the rack and broke the rack, and now I'm in trouble, but that's another story. And then let them go for 2 to 3 weeks. Cut the stalk back. And if you were passing it around, you saw my stalk. I cut it back to about 1 inch. Some people will say 2 inches, but 1 inch is regulation for showing at the fair. So that's why I do it to 1 inch. And then trim the roots back to about 1/4 inch, just enough to see the bristles. The recommendation is also only take off the outer wrapper. Don't keep going unless you're looking for those perfect ones for the fair. Only take off the outer wrapper. The more wrappers, the more slowly they will dry out and the longer they'll last. Okay. So keep the wrappers on. Don't break them apart into cloves until you are ready to eat them. Okay. Mesh bags. I just hang them in mesh bags in the basement. Some are cool. Don't put them in the fridge. Some are cool. Some are with relatively low humidity. Okay. And away from the light. So I put them in the darkest, coolest corner of our basement, and I just hang them from the floor joists in mesh bags. And every couple of weeks, I look at them and say, does anyone look kind of funky? You're next to be eaten. Okay. You can save your crop for the next planting. Once you buy garlic, unless you want to dramatically increase your number of garlics, you don't have to buy it again if you have a good crop. The ratio is somewhere between 1 to 8 and 1 to 10. 1 clove will give you a bulb with maybe 6, 8, 10 cloves. And then guess what? We're ready to go again. We've dug the garlic, we've dried the garlic, we've entered it in the fair. You all are competing with me. I'm going to be really angry when I see your names with the blue ribbons this year. What are we doing between harvesting and going to the fair? We're still working on that soil. If we're going to put garlic back in there, I'm going to add some nutrients back to the soil. So I'm going to put in something like well-rotted manure, stuff from the chicken's coop that's been rotting for a year, or good compost, Or if I'm feeling really ambitious and it's not too hot to plant things in the garden, I'll plant a cover crop as what's called a green manure. I've only used buckwheat, but I've read people have used other things. People will use ryegrass, and I've read people will put mustards, even clovers. Let it grow until about the beginning of September, and then dig it in, and it will rot in the soil, and it'll add organic matter and nutrients. So that's another possibility, to keep that soil rich. Should you rotate? Last question. Everyone who's a good gardener is going to say rotate, rotate, rotate crops. Don't plant the same thing 2 years in a row in the same space. Well, I wish that they would come and build more raised beds for me, then I could do that. But I can't. Okay. So I at least try to alternate years. So even if I can't put them here 1 year and then something else years 2 and 3, and not plant again until year 4, I can't always do that, but at least I try to skip years. So 1 year garlic, 1 year not an allium. So maybe potatoes, 1 year garlic, 1 year not. It prevents pests from building up in the soil. And garlic doesn't have a lot of pests, but they do have some insect pests like little onion thrips and onion maggots. And the big problem seems to be various types of molds or rots. I got pink rot once, and I just had to literally start over. I tossed out all the garlic, and I just let that raised bed sit, and it's literally just sitting at the back of my property, and I'm not doing anything with the soil. It's literally just, the wood's just rotting, because I read that can last up to 20 years. Yeah, so that's another reason why buying what you start with from a good company, a reputable source, where you're pretty confident that what you get is clean and pest-free. Want to know more? I'm happy to talk until Sydney throws me out. The handout from Southern Exposure Seed Exchange is for all alliums, but it's a lovely, good, comprehensive handout. If you really want to dork out on garlic, this is still the definitive book. It's a few decades old now, but Growing Great Garlic is still more than you ever wanted to know about garlic.